When you're dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, the first mistake most people make is assuming distance means disinterest. That's not always the case. An avoidant doesn't usually pull back because they've stopped caring. They pull back because closeness, emotional intimacy, vulnerability feels like danger to their nervous system. And if you don't understand that, you end up misreading their silence as rejection, and then you respond in ways that push them even further away. Think about it. If you text them 3 times in a row when they don't respond, if you push for answers when they need space, if you ask, "Why are you ignoring me?" what you're actually doing is confirming their deepest fear. That intimacy equals pressure. They don't experience your reach as love. They experience it as control. And that's why understanding their mindset is absolutely essential before you try to reconnect. The psychology behind this is fascinating. Avoidants are often people who, very early in life, learned that their needs weren't consistently met. Maybe they had caregivers who were emotionally unavailable or who shamed them for expressing feelings. So they adapted. They said, "Fine, I won't need anybody. I'll rely on myself." And that survival strategy becomes their template for love in adulthood. They don't stop craving connection. We all crave connection. It's hardwired. But they manage that craving by keeping people at arm's length. It's self-protection. Now here's where it gets interesting. If you want to trigger an avoidant to reconnect, you have to stop trying to force your way through the front door. Because the more you push, the more they retreat. Instead, you study the architecture of that locked house they live in. You understand why the walls are there, and then you start speaking to the part of them that secretly wants closeness, but is terrified of losing control. That's empathy, not strategy. Philosophically, it comes down to this: the human condition is a tension between freedom and belonging. The avoidant leans too heavily toward freedom. They value independence to the point where belonging feels like a threat. But the truth is, neither extreme works. Total independence leaves us lonely. Total dependence leaves us suffocated. So the work of reconnecting with an avoidant isn't about dragging them into closeness. It's about embodying balance. You have to model what healthy connection looks like: space without abandonment, presence without suffocation. And I want you to reflect on this. If their pulling back makes you panic, what does that say about your own attachment system? Are you expecting their closeness to regulate your worth? Because if that's the case, then you're not really reconnecting. You're chasing validation. And avoidants can smell that neediness immediately. It's like smoke to their nervous system. They're gone. So the shift begins inside you. You understand them, yes, but you also understand yourself. You realize that their distance isn't a personal attack, it's a survival strategy. And just like any strategy, it has limitations. They keep people away so they won't get hurt, but in doing so, they also keep love away. When you see that clearly, you stop personalizing their behavior and start responding with composure. Let me give you an example. Imagine someone you care about hasn't responded in days. Your instinct is to double text to demand clarity. But instead you pause. You remind yourself, this isn't about me, it's about how they regulate closeness. And from that place of steadiness, you send a message that carries no pressure. Something simple, light, maybe even playful. Suddenly, they feel a shift. They don't sense demand, they sense safety. And for an avoidant, safety is the key that unlocks the door to reconnection. What you're really doing here is rewiring the dynamic. Instead of matching their avoidance with anxiety, you meet it with stability. And over time, that consistency chips away at the narrative in their head that says, Closeness equals loss of freedom. You're showing them a new story. That closeness can coexist with respect, with autonomy, with ease. That's what makes an avoidant lean back in. So before you even think about what text to send, or how to initiate a call, or what clever strategy to use, you must first align with this truth: their withdrawal is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their wiring. And when you can hold that perspective, you stop reacting to their distance with fear. You start approaching it with wisdom. And here's the paradox. When you stop needing them to reconnect in order for you to feel okay, that's when they start feeling safe enough to reconnect, because the pressure is gone. The power struggle dissolves. You've replaced demand with understanding and control with compassion. That's the foundation of everything else. Because if you don't truly grasp the avoidant mindset, every strategy you try will come off as manipulation. But when you do understand it, your presence becomes the very thing they didn't know they were missing. Connection without the cost of freedom. So the first step in triggering an avoidant to reconnect isn't about them at all. It's about you. It's about seeing clearly, responding calmly, and remembering this distance is not rejection. It's fear disguised as independence. And when you meet fear with steadiness, you create the conditions where love has a chance to return. Now, once you understand what's really happening in the mind of an avoidant, the next move is counterintuitive. Most of us think, if they're pulling away, I need to close the gap. I need to show them I care. I need to remind them of what we had. But that instinct, while human, is exactly what backfires with an avoidant. Because when you chase, they withdraw even further. It's not malice. It's the way their nervous system maintains balance. They feel pressure, they run. And so the cycle continues. The more you pursue, the more they retreat. The way to interrupt that cycle is not by doubling down on pursuit, but by doing the opposite. By stepping back, by detaching emotionally. And let me be clear, detachment does not mean indifference. It doesn't mean you stop caring or you shut your feelings down. What it means is you learn how to hold your feelings without spilling them all over the other person. You learn how to regulate your own anxiety so you don't outsource it to someone who can't handle that intensity. That is where your power is. This is one of the most difficult lessons because when we feel abandoned, our biology screams at us to fix it. The anxious part of our attachment system is wired to close the gap immediately. But here's the paradox: when you can resist that urge, when you allow space instead of collapsing it, you actually become magnetic to an avoidant. Why? Because you're doing the one thing they don't expect. You're not chasing. You're not feeding the pattern. You're signaling, I am safe, I am steady, I am not here to control you. And that message, though silent, is powerful enough to shift the entire dynamic. Think about relationships like a dance. The anxious partner usually takes a step forward. The avoidant steps back. The more one moves in, the more the other pulls away. It becomes a choreography of frustration. But imagine what happens if the forward step stops. If instead of lunging forward, you pause. You ground yourself. You stand in place with calm energy. Suddenly the rhythm is disrupted. The avoidant, who expected to retreat further, now feels something they don't normally feel: space without abandonment. That subtle shift creates curiosity. Curiosity draws them back into the dance. There's also a deeper psychological principle here. We are wired to notice absence. When you stop chasing, when you stop flooding their inbox, when you stop begging for closeness, the silence you create isn't emptiness. It's presence. It's a different kind of presence. It invites them to lean in, to wonder what you're doing, to feel the gap they once took for granted. Space, when held with composure, is one of the most powerful attractors there is. Philosophically, this is about self-mastery, because what you're really doing when you detach is proving to yourself that your sense of worth isn't dependent on someone else's immediate response. You're showing that you can tolerate uncertainty, that you don't need to control the outcome in order to feel secure in who you are. And that, ironically, is what makes the avoidant begin to feel secure around you. Because nothing is more threatening to them than someone who demands constant reassurance. But nothing is more disarming than someone who radiates calm, self-contained strength. Let me share a simple reframe. Every time you feel the urge to chase, remind yourself it's not about closing the gap. It's about holding the ground. It's about becoming so steady in yourself that you no longer contribute to the push-pull cycle. That steadiness is what shifts the dynamic from reactive to intentional. I'll give you a practical example. Say you haven't heard from them in a week. Your first instinct might be to send 3 texts in a row. Hey, are you okay? Why haven't you responded? Did I do something wrong? That's chase energy. Instead, you step back. You take a breath. You remind yourself their silence is not a reflection of my worth. Then, if you reach out, it's one calm, low-stakes message. No pressure, no neediness. Something like, saw this and thought of you. And then you let it be. That's what detachment looks like in action. And here's the paradox again. When you stop obsessing over their response, you free up energy to pour back into yourself. You invest in your passions, your friendships, your growth. And as you expand your own life, you become less dependent on whether or not they show up. That shift doesn't just change how they experience you. It changes how you experience yourself. You become whole, not waiting for someone else to complete you. And wholeness is irresistible. So when I say detach emotionally, I don't mean shut down. I mean hold space. Hold space for your own feelings without projecting them onto the other person. Hold space for their distance without spiraling into panic. Hold space for the possibility that reconnection will happen naturally when pressure is removed. That kind of detachment is not weakness. It's strength in its highest form. And here's the truth avoidants don't reconnect because you beg them to. They reconnect when they sense you've stopped needing them to regulate your emotions. They reconnect when they feel free to step toward you without being swallowed. They reconnect when the space you've created feels safe enough to enter. So once you've understood the avoidant mindset and you've mastered the art of stepping back instead of chasing, the next piece is about what you actually radiate in that space. Because here's the truth. Avoidants don't respond to words nearly as much as they respond to consistent energy. You can say, I'm not needy, I'm independent. I respect your space. But if your actions tell a different story, if you're still waiting by the phone or subtly testing them, they'll feel that dissonance. And the avoidant nervous system is hypersensitive to dissonance. They trust what you do, not what you say. This is why showing, rather than telling, that you are secure is so critical. It's not about making promises or explaining yourself. It's about living in such a way that your steadiness becomes undeniable. You demonstrate security by how you move in the world, by the fact that you're invested in your own growth, your own passions, your own friendships, your own life. When you're grounded in yourself, you stop demanding that someone else be the ground beneath you. And that is exactly the kind of energy that makes an avoidant feel safe enough to reconnect. Think about it. Most people interact with avoidance from a place of hidden agenda. They say, take your time. I understand. But deep down they're waiting, calculating, holding on to the expectation of closeness. And the avoidant senses it. It feels like a trap. It feels like false calm. Like someone trying to soothe them just long enough to get what they want. That triggers all the old defenses, and suddenly the walls go up again. But when you genuinely stand in your own security, there is no hidden agenda. You don't need them to move a certain way in order for you to stay centered. And paradoxically, that's when they're most likely to move toward you. There's a psychological depth to this attachment, is about regulation. Anxious people regulate by reaching for others. Avoidants regulate by retreating into themselves. But the secure individual regulates within. They don't outsource their stability. They generate it. And when you model that kind of self-regulation, you become a different presence entirely in the relationship. You're no longer part of the push-pull game. You're steady ground. And steady ground is magnetic to someone who lives in a world of emotional earthquakes. Philosophically, this speaks to a bigger truth. Authenticity is not declared, it's embodied. You don't convince someone of who you are by telling them. You convince them by being it. By living it, day in and day out, until it becomes unquestionable. And that's what avoidants need. They need to feel. Not hear, not imagine, but feel that you are someone who can hold your own center without collapsing into them. That sense of stability is what allows their guard to come down little by little. Let's make this concrete. Imagine you've pulled back, you've created space. Now they send a tentative message. If you're still anxious underneath, you might respond too quickly, too intensely. You might try to cram weeks of silence into one text, and even though your words are sweet, the energy underneath says, "Finally, you're back!" Don't leave again. That pressure leaks through. But if you're genuinely secure, your response is calm, warm, but not heavy. Something like, "Hey, good to hear from you. How have you been?" That's the language of security. Present, open, but not grasping. And here's the beauty of showing security. It doesn't just impact them. It transforms you. Because when you live in alignment with your own independence and wholeness, you stop waiting for their reconnection to validate your worth. You've already validated yourself. The reconnection becomes a bonus, not a lifeline. That shift frees you. It puts you back in control of your emotional state, which is the very thing an avoidant finds so calming. They don't want to be someone's lifeline. They want to be someone's partner. And there's a big difference. One of the most powerful things you can do is pursue your own passions with real commitment. Not as a tactic, not as a game of, "Look how happy I am without you," but because your life is worth living fully regardless of their presence. When you live that way, they see a version of you that's whole, radiant, unneedy. And that image cuts through their fear. Because deep down, avoidants don't actually want someone who doesn't need anyone. They want someone who chooses them freely without desperation. So every time you're tempted to prove your security with words, pause. Ask yourself, am I embodying it instead? Am I actually living in a way that communicates steadiness, independence, presence? Or am I trying to convince them of something I don't yet believe about myself? Because if you don't truly believe it, they won't either. And here's the paradox again. When you stop trying to prove security and actually become secure, you no longer need their reconnection in order to feel whole. And that is precisely the moment when reconnection becomes possible, because they sense it. They feel that you're not waiting, not clinging, not performing. You're just living. And that freedom is what makes an avoidant lean back in step by step. So now we've laid the groundwork. You understand their mindset. You've learned to detach instead of chase. You've started to embody security instead of just talking about it. The next step is the practical bridge. How do you actually reach out? How do you reconnect without triggering the very defenses you've been working so hard to lower? This is where subtlety becomes your greatest ally. With an avoidant, the way you initiate contact matters more than most people realize. If you come in with force, we need to talk. I need to know where we stand. Why are you avoiding me? You might as well be pulling a fire alarm inside their nervous system. Every one of those approaches screams pressure. And for someone wired to see closeness as a potential loss of control, pressure equals danger. Danger equals retreat. But if you shift your approach from demands to invitations, everything changes. You're no longer cornering them into a conversation. You're simply cracking the door open and letting them choose to walk through. That choice is everything to an avoidant. It preserves their sense of autonomy, which is their deepest need. And ironically, when you give them freedom, they're far more likely to use it to move toward you. This is why your language has to be low stakes, casual, and light. Instead of saying, "Can we sit down and figure this out?" which sounds heavy and serious, you might say, "Hey, I saw something today that reminded me of you." That one sentence carries zero obligation. It doesn't demand a response. It doesn't corner them into explaining themselves. It simply offers a thread. And threads are safe. Threads are easy to pick up. What you're really doing here is practicing non-attachment in communication. You send a message, not as a test of whether they still care, but as an offering. If they respond, great. If they don't, you remain grounded because your worth isn't riding on it. That's what makes your invitation so powerful. It's free of the energy of demand. Psychologically, this ties back to what we know about avoidant coping. Their system is constantly scanning for signs of control. The moment they feel trapped, their instinct is to escape. But when your outreach feels like a choice, not a trap, their defenses don't activate. And when their defenses don't activate, curiosity has room to grow. Curiosity is what opens the door to genuine reconnection. Philosophically, this is about respecting freedom as much as you value closeness. True connection isn't about forcing someone into your world. It's about creating a space they want to enter. Love that demands is control. Love that invites is freedom. And freedom is what makes love sustainable. Here's a concrete scenario. Imagine you want to see them in person. The anxious way would be to say, "Can we meet? We need to talk about what's happening between us." That's loaded. That screams expectation. Instead, you reframe it into something light. "Hey, I found this new coffee spot, and I think you'd like it." It's an invitation, not a demand. If they say no, it doesn't fracture you. If they say yes, you've just created an opportunity for connection without triggering avoidance. This isn't about playing games or pretending you don't care. It's about shifting the energy of your communication so it feels safe. It's about showing that you respect their autonomy while still signaling that the door is open. You're saying, "I see you. I think of you, but I don't need to trap you." That's the energy that draws avoidance back. Now, let's zoom out. Isn't this, in a larger sense, the essence of healthy connection? Every relationship is stronger when invitations replace demands. Demands may get compliance, but they rarely get closeness. Invitations, on the other hand, create choice. And where there is choice, there is authenticity. And where there is authenticity, there is trust. When you start practicing this with an avoidant, you'll notice something interesting. Your own anxiety begins to shift too, because you're no longer hanging on every response as proof of your worth. You're offering, not begging. You're inviting, not controlling. That subtle difference gives you a sense of dignity and calm. You're not chasing validation. You're extending a hand. Whether they take it or not doesn't define you. And when you realize that, you free yourself. So, the art here is subtlety. It's restraint. It's replacing heavy demands with light invitations, but knowing that the goal is not to force reconnection, but to create the conditions where reconnection becomes possible. And that requires patience. It requires trust, not just in them, but in yourself. The trust that you can hold your ground, that you can make space, that you can invite without clinging. And if you get nothing else from this point, take this avoidance. Don't respond to pressure. They respond to safety. Every invitation you extend is not really about coffee or a memory or a funny video you share. It's about signaling safety. It's about saying, I can want you without needing to control you. And that is what makes them feel free enough to want you back. So once you've shifted from demands to subtle invitations, the next layer is about the emotional energy you bring when you do reconnect. And this is where most people unconsciously sabotage themselves. Because what often drives their communication with an avoidant isn't calm lightness or warmth, it's fear. Fear of losing them, fear of not being enough, fear of rejection. And fear always leaks through, no matter how carefully you try to mask it. The avoidant feels it, and because they're wired to associate emotional intensity with danger, they retreat again. What changes the game is when you consciously anchor your connection in positive emotional associations. Because at the end of the day, avoidants don't actually avoid love. They avoid discomfort. They avoid environments that feel like pressure, judgment, or emotional chaos. So if your presence consistently feels heavy, critical, or anxious, they'll do what they've always done, distance themselves. But if your presence feels light, joyful, even playful, you shift the entire association they have with you. You're no longer linked in their mind with stress. You're linked with relief, with safety, with something that makes life feel easier, not harder. This isn't about faking positivity or plastering a smile over your real feelings. It's about choosing how you show up. You can still have depth, still be authentic, still acknowledge real challenges. But you balance that with warmth, humor, and an energy that says, being around me won't cost you your peace. That balance is powerful because it disarms the avoidant's core defense mechanism. Their nervous system starts to learn that closeness with you isn't something to fear. It's something that feels good. Think about it in your own life. Don't you find yourself drawn back to people who make you feel good to be around? Not the ones who drain you, or interrogate you, or constantly keep score, but the ones who laugh easily, the ones who can sit with you in silence without judgment, the ones who bring a lightness that makes the weight you're carrying feel less heavy. That's what keeps us coming back to people. And avoidants are no different. In fact, they crave that even more because their lives are often dominated by the tension of holding everything in, keeping everything under control. When you become a source of release instead of more tension, you become magnetic. Philosophically, this is about reframing love itself. Too many people equate love with intensity, grand gestures, serious talks, passionate confrontations. But love at its healthiest isn't heavy. It's spacious. It's enlivening. It feels like oxygen, not like a cage. When you bring that energy into your interactions, you're not just triggering reconnection. You're embodying the kind of love that actually lasts. Here's a concrete example. Imagine you finally see your avoidant partner after some distance. If your first instinct is to jump straight into, "We need to talk about us," You've already lost them. They're bracing, scanning for pressure, already halfway out the door in their mind. But if instead you start with something light, sharing a funny story, bringing up a memory that made you laugh, even just greeting them with warmth and ease, you immediately lower the walls. You set the tone. And once the tone is safe, the door to deeper connection opens naturally. And this doesn't only apply in direct conversations. It applies to every interaction. The text you send, the way you carry yourself, the energy you radiate when you walk into a room. Are you bringing intensity or are you bringing lightness? Are you reminding them of everything that's wrong, or are you reminding them, through your presence, that connection can feel good? That choice is always yours. Now here's the deeper psychological truth. Humans are wired to repeat experiences that feel rewarding. If your dynamic with someone feels heavy, they'll subconsciously avoid repeating it. If your dynamic feels rewarding, they'll seek it out again. You're not manipulating. You're simply creating the conditions where connection feels safe, rewarding, and worth returning to. That's how you recondition an avoidance nervous system over time. And here's where the self-reflection comes in. Ask yourself, when they think of me, what emotional experience do they associate with my presence? Do they think stress, pressure, intensity? Or do they think warmth, ease, and safety? That awareness can be confronting, but it's also empowering. Because it means you can change it. You can consciously start showing up differently, not by pretending, but by shifting your own energy first. And this is the paradox again. When you focus less on fixing the relationship and more on becoming a source of genuine positivity in your own life, you naturally radiate the kind of energy that draws them back. Because you're not just saying, I'm fine. You're living in a way that's grounded, joyful, whole. And that is irresistible, not just to avoidance, but to anyone. So the question becomes, what associations do you want to create in their mind when they think of you? Because every interaction is a vote. Every conversation, every text, every moment together is teaching their nervous system what to expect from closeness with you. Make it light, make it safe, make it rewarding. And slowly, steadily, you replace fear with desire, patience and timing, two words that sound so simple, but hold the weight of the entire process. If you take everything we've explored, the understanding of the avoidant mindset, the discipline of detachment, the embodiment of security, the subtlety of invitations, and the creation of positive associations, none of it truly works without patience. And this is where most people lose it. They do the right things for a week, maybe two, and then when the avoidant doesn't immediately rush back in, the anxiety takes over. They push, they demand, they ask, how much longer do I have to wait? And in that single moment, all the progress collapses. Because the truth is, avoidants move on their own timeline, not yours. You can't rush a nervous system into feeling safe. You can't force someone to dismantle defenses they've spent a lifetime building. What you can do is create the conditions that make reconnection possible, and then wait with grace. And I know that's hard. Waiting without certainty feels unbearable for most of us. But this is where the growth is. Because patience isn't just about them. It's about you learning to tolerate uncertainty without losing yourself. Psychologically, this is about nervous system regulation again. Anxious attachment craves immediate reassurance. Avoidant attachment craves distance. Security sits in the middle. Security says, I can tolerate the gap. I can wait without collapsing. And when you embody that, you're not just creating space for the avoidant, you're strengthening yourself. You're practicing resilience, you're building self-trust, You're proving to yourself that you can survive discomfort without scrambling to erase it. That's not just relational growth. That's personal evolution. And philosophically, patience is about honoring timing as a natural law. Everything in nature has a rhythm. Flowers don't bloom because you shout at them. The tide doesn't rise faster because you tap your foot at the shore. Love is the same. You can't make someone's defenses fall on your schedule. You can only invite, embody, and allow. To truly love someone with an avoidant pattern is to respect their rhythm, even when it doesn't match your own. Now let's get practical.